A little bit about sustainability and climate change. First, sustainability. Sustainability is a concept that expresses our desire as humans for health and happiness within the context of a healthy planet over the long term. You may have seen it expressed this way by the United Nations. This was in 1987, and this often makes its way into the definition of many different organizations' sustainability work. You also could encounter sustainability in a few other ways, like the triple bottom line. This is the concept that financial, social, and environmental considerations are all important. You can see it maybe represented by that diagram on the right, which I think is terrible. That one, if anything, is a better diagram. Or if you want to read about it in a children's book, the Lorax is great. Talk about sustainability, triple bottom line kind of stuff. You might also see it in something like a B corporation, where you can set specific stakeholder considerations like sustainability as an equal part in governance structure to profitability. So something like Patagonia is a B corporation. You also see corporate social responsibility reports or corporate social responsibility. That's basically accountability for the social consequences of business activities. In modern times, we also include environmental consequences there. So companies issue these reports sometimes to sort of report on how they're doing, and they often include metrics that are tied into national or global standards. So the idea is to turn the company on the left into the company on the right. At least that's the big idea. Practical sustainability is what I would call sort of what we're really doing when it comes down to projects and companies and things like that. It's really means going above and beyond standard practice or the required national regulatory minimums, or showing innovation in meeting these standards and minimums in support of people and the environment. So the minimums kind of tell us, well, we have to do some of these things, but we can go beyond that. We know we can, but we don't have to because it's beyond the minimum. And the question is, will you? So I look at practical sustainability as more than the minimum, being innovative, and doing all that in support of people and the environment. Now, sustainability has three dimensions. Typically have to consider them all, but you almost always have to set priorities. You can't sort of magically balance all three of these: environment, people, and economy. I'll give you a couple of examples. So first, here's an environmental priority project, a Green Roads project. This is Yellowstone National Park, Grand Loop Highway, Madison to Norris. Clearly an environmental priority, right? It's in the middle of a national park. So that takes priority when we have to make trade-offs. And here's a human priority one in the middle of Houston, Texas, right? There are lots of people living there. So a lot of human considerations here. And the human ones went out when we have to make trade-offs. Some other sustainability characteristics to remember. It's a high-level strategy. It's the ultimate goal of a business, not just an add-on project feature. Typically, when companies talk about doing sustainability, they're talking about elevating the value of humans, environment, and the long term. Sustainability almost always involves priorities and trade-offs. You can't do everything. You have to pick priorities. And it depends upon the context. Those priorities depend upon the context you're in. Think of those last two examples in Yellowstone and downtown Houston. It also implies improvement. We should get better over time. Like we said before, to go beyond the bare minimum is a really good idea. Regulations are the bare minimum. They don't drive improvement. Sustainability should constantly evolve. So what was once exceptional becomes standard practice, and we move on, and something else becomes the forefront and the sustainable practice. And they really have to create value, sustainable ideas, right? If sustainability is only a cost, it will be a low priority, and we'll only do it when we have money, which isn't all the time, which is about how often we need to do this, I think. Okay, so climate change is usually a part of sustainability. Like, for instance, Walmart, in their sustainability approach, they list 4 major components, one of which is addressing climate change. So a little bit about climate change. First, some definitions. Greenhouse gases. A greenhouse gas is a gas in the atmosphere that absorbs and emits radiation within the thermal infrared range. The primary greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere are water vapor and clouds, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, ozone, and they greatly affect the temperature of the Earth. Without them, the Earth's surface would be a bit cooler. Here is the greenhouse effect process. You can stop this and read it if you wish. It's given to you by the Australian government, but I think it's a pretty straightforward thing. The end result being human activities are increasing the amount of greenhouse gases released to the atmosphere, and that's trapping extra heat, causing the temperature of the Earth's surface to rise. Global warming potential. That's a relative measure of how much heat a greenhouse gas traps in the atmosphere. It compares the amount of heat trapped by a certain mass of the gas in question to the amount of heat trapped by a similar mass of carbon dioxide. A global warming potential is calculated over a specific time interval. Usually that's like 20, 100, 500 years. The global warming potential depends on a bunch of things, but three main ones. The absorption of infrared radiation by a given species, so how much does this gas absorb? The spectral location of its absorbing wavelengths, and the atmospheric lifetime of the species. How long does it absorb that? So in general, a high global warming potential correlates with a large infrared absorption and a long atmospheric lifetime. Here's some examples of global warming potential values of different gases. So you can see carbon dioxide, its global warming potential is 1 because it's the standard that we're comparing everything else to. Methane is 21, so 21 times the absorption for the same amount of gas. And then nitrous oxide even more, and then you can see refrigerants are way, way more, right? So they all have different impacts, and some of the ones on the bottom are a lot more so than carbon dioxide, but there's a lot less of them in the atmosphere, although they are very, very impactful. A carbon dioxide equivalent is a quantity that describes, for a given mixture and amount of greenhouse gas, the amount of carbon dioxide that would have the same global warming potential when measured over a specified time scale. Generally, that time scale is 100 years, but usually people don't talk about it, but it has to be there. This is a little Sankey diagram that kind of shows the U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. From the left side, it shows you the reporting category or the sector, like transportation, for instance, at 27.2%. The end use or activity, so most of that is driving vehicles on roads. And then the gas that is emitted. So most of that is carbon dioxide. Another thing is currently the U.S. is back in the Paris Climate Agreement. So a little bit about this. It's a legally binding international treaty on climate change. They met and figured it out in 2015. It was ratified in 2016. What is the basic agreement among signers? Well, they say they want to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade, preferably 1.5 degrees centigrade compared to pre-industrial levels. So what do countries have to do in this agreement? Well, the mandatory part is by 2020, so they've already had to do this. Countries submit their plans for climate action, known as their nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. In their NDCs, they communicate their actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and improve resilience through climate change adaptation. So basically, this is our plan to get better. And these NDCs are sort of on a 5-year rolling cycle. So each one has to be better, more severe, and more consequential than the last one. So get better, get better, get better. That's the part they have to do. The voluntary part is countries can, if they want, submit their long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategies. So what's it practically mean in the U.S.? So the Biden, now the U.S., climate strategy aims for net zero emissions by 2050. This is a popular goal around the world. Many countries have adopted similar goals. For example, China has committed to net zero by 2060. You might ask briefly, didn't we leave the Paris Agreement? Yes, the previous administration wanted to get out, but based on the Paris Agreement and some of the details, they were only allowed to officially leave on November 4th, 2020. And then Biden asked for reinstatement the first day in office, and on February 19th, the U.S. was readmitted. So we were really only gone for a couple of months, really. When we're talking about emissions and greenhouse gases, we want to talk about or categorize these emissions from organizations in particular. And we typically use the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. That's the most widely used international accounting tool. You can see the web address there. And that categorizes emissions from organizations into 3 groups. There's Scope 1, which are direct emissions from sources that are owned or controlled by the organization. So the big ones here are like on-site fossil fuel consumption. So think about like burners in your hot mix plants. And fleet fuel consumption, so trucks and vehicles. Scope 2 are indirect emissions from sources that are owned or controlled by the company or organization. So the big ones here are emissions resulting from electricity generation that the company purchases, so the electricity you buy. And then there's Scope 3 emissions. These are emissions from sources that are not owned or directly controlled by the organization. So there's a lot of these in here, and they include things like business travel, right? Air travel, or car travel, anything you procure, supply chain, stuff in your supply chain, investments, what you invest in, waste, water, the use of your sold products, all that kind of stuff. This is usually the largest group by far and the hardest one to get a handle on what those numbers really are, and they're the hardest ones to get under control. Okay,